Hi everyone, thanks for having us to speak today. So my name is Dan Kidby. I'm co-founder of Animal Rebellion and a few other kind of animal rights organisations, and I'm here presenting today with Alex Lockwood. We're both here from England, and so we're going to be kind of speaking largely from our context, not being overly familiar with the Estonian context and movement. I can't remember what our presentation title was, but it's something. Oh, do you know, Alex?
The evolving narrative of the climate and animal movements.
There we go, the evolving narrative of the climate and animal movements. So yeah, the way in which we are going to present this is I will kind of go over kind of like a brief summary of, say, the last like 20 years of looking at how the climate narrative and the animal narrative have evolved alongside one another. Alex will then follow up, bringing a very theoretical narrative lens using his kind of expertise from doing various kind of academic and practical work within the animal movements around narrative and communications. And then I will then speak again to talk about where we see the kind of narratives could be evolving into the future as we step into the urgent times that we are in with respect to the climate and animal emergencies. So there are a number of things, I think, to track in terms of the development of the climate and animal narratives. And these are, firstly, the growing awareness of the fact that we are destroying our life support systems. That's both on an information level, but also there's been an increasing emotional connection of what this means and the devastation that is currently happening and will be happening in the future. And with that emotional connection is the increasing realization of the urgency to completely transform our entire way of life and society. Secondly, alongside that, you've got the growth in very bold climate action, particularly moving in the direction of non-violent civil resistance. And this is, of course, seeking to shift public consciousness and to pressure governments to implement the transformative changes we need. Thirdly, there's the growing awareness of the role that animal farming and fishing plays in causing the climate and ecological emergency. And then fourthly is the growing boldness and confidence in the animal movements and those working at the intersection of climate and animal issues in the need to kind of act on animal farming and fishing. And there's particularly, this has been developing in relation to from the move to speaking of individual changes in our own diets, to the institutional and systemic demands calling for the complete transformation of our food systems to a plant-based food system. So in terms of the trajectory of how this narrative have developed, it's a bit arbitrary of where we start this story, but I feel like it's useful to kind of start from, say, like the mid-2000s. This is like a time where social movements have really died down and it's very quiet following a massive kind of government repression on protesters, particularly like following 9/11 and a lot of the anti-terror legislation that came in. And we saw a number of environmental protesters and anti-vivisection protesters being imprisoned for quite a lengthy period of time. And that really chilled the movement and quietened down a lot of the protest activity. So this was kind of a time when the animal rights movement was very focused on kind of organizing veg fests and vegan festivals, and the environmental movement talking a lot about kind of individual consumer changes. And so there's a lot about the lifestyle of environmentalism and vegan consciousness. And it was around this time that really the environmental issue was really beginning to be understood as like in terms of the public, general public, understanding the nature of the climate change as an issue. Al Gore's documentary, The Inconvenient Truth, really educated a lot of people about greenhouse gas emissions. And it was that same year in 2006 that the UN published their report of livestock's long shadow, kind of in a really significant institutional way, legitimizing the role of animal ag and fishing in contributing to the climate crisis. So of course, this issue at that time was by no means publicly known, just kind of entering into the academic and institutional conversations. 2008 happened, financial crash shook the world, and with that came a return to mass protests. The Occupy Wall Street movement particularly exemplified that in the West. And within that movement, of course, the environmental crisis was very present. And we saw that in how that movement kind of then moved into a big mobilization in COP15 in Copenhagen towards trying to get action at the conferences. And of course, for people who were around at that time, it's well remembered as a very disillusioning experience for environmental campaigners in seeing the failure of institutional action on climate. But with that resurgence of protest, we also saw the emergence of grassroots movements within the animal rights space. So not long after Occupy, we had in 2010 the birth of the Save movement, which really returned people on the ground doing animal rights action. And over the years, they've been able to mobilize thousands of people to go and bear witness to suffering at slaughterhouses. Moving forward again, 2014 was probably a very big year. The year before the Paris conference, which was the next big international point for action, of potential action. And during that year, we saw two things. One was the publication of Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, which really kind of galvanized at least progressives towards the need for transformative change. And it kind of really challenged the idea that we can solve this crisis through personal individual changes, or what George Monbiot has called micro-consumerist bollocks, in terms of shorter showers, reusable cotton buds and the like, and kind of really bringing the conversation back to the fact that we do need transformative change to our economies and political systems. Also in that same year, we saw another challenge taking place, which was through Cowspiracy. This documentary really popularized the links between animal farming and the climate crisis, bringing to the fore what was identified in livestock's long shadow, and also offering a challenge to the environmental movement to take this issue seriously. And for them, it really did come as a challenge to the environmental movement. And one of the key narratives that emerged from that was that you can't be a meat-eating environmentalist. So really placing the animal movements and the climate movements in opposition to one another. Then we have the Paris conference in 2015, which had a lot of fanfare about it, but no policies to back it up. So again, another, not necessarily a disillusioning experience for many people, but certainly just a realization of how screwed we really are, and how the institutions are failing to take up the challenge of our times. And over the next few years, we really, within the animal movement, saw, following Cowspiracy, the emergence of this like exponential growth of stuff like Veganuary, the real rise of veganism. And we saw the emergence of, within the climate space, you know, this kind of go vegan, save the planet message began to be really prominent. And also we saw the you can't be a meat-eating environmentalist emerge within environmental protests. You would see animal rights protesters would stand on the side of environmental marches, holding their signs in a way to kind of really challenge that movement to step up. And there was also, of course, the ongoing debate of whether we should be using reducitarian messaging or vegan messaging in our kind of individual lifestyle changes. But of course, within the environmental space, the need for complete overhaul of our systems was really taking hold. And this really came to the fore in 2018 with Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg's fearless truth-telling, really speaking from the perspective of the youth and waking up the world to the urgent need for change. And following that, very soon after, of course, was Extinction Rebellion, which the April 2019 rebellion was an absolutely key transformative cultural moment around the world, which was followed by the declaration of climate emergencies by many national governments and local institutions. And it was clear at that moment that everything had really changed and that the climate crisis was going to be the defining issue of our generation. You had within England like 77% of people recognizing the fact that we're in a climate emergency when they were polled about it. Within the animal rights movement, we really looked to capitalize on this with the creation of Animal Rebellion, to take on this clear cultural shift that had been taking place, the real urgency for transformative change, and saw that there was an opportunity for the environmental movements and the animal movements to come together. No longer was it a time for us just to be simply criticizing the environmental movements, but it's time for us to go and stand side by side and take our place and let animal agriculture take its place alongside the climate issues. So we did this, and through building this organization and this movement in alliance with Extinction Rebellion, we brought with it some really fundamental shifts to the narrative. So firstly, there is that we were coming forward as climate protesters rather than as animals, like removing that sense of separation. And secondly, there was the move away from the individual lifestyle change messaging that the environmental movement had been moving away from, and the embracing of radical transformative change. And we popularized that with the demand for a transition to a sustainable and just plant-based food system. And of course, immediately following that, Veganuary 2020 had its biggest year and really broke into being a mainstream cultural phenomenon, even being referenced in Christmas TV dramas. And we saw the environmental movement start picking up the narrative. Figures like George Monbiot with his documentary Cowpocalypse, really emphasizing this and gaining it legitimacy in the environmental movement. And within the animal rights space, we saw other organizations really take this on. And we've seen lots of campaigns emerge calling for institutional changes and within councils, universities, divestment campaigns to remove funding, and campaigns to change menus within institutions. We've got things like the Plant-Based Treaty campaign, which is following the model of the Fossil Fuel Treaty in trying to get international agreement behind a treaty to be transitioning towards a plant-based food system. And we've also seen the work, systemic work being done to help bring about the plant-based food system, particularly with work with farmers to help them transition. So organizations like Refarmed and Growing Green from the Vegan Society and Viva's new project, Viva Farmers, to really work with farmers rather than see them as the enemy. And now being 2022 that we're in, there's this real increasing recognition of the urgency to change. We have figures like David Attenborough talking about the end of civilization, Boris Johnson talking about mass crop failures. Sir David King, the chief scientific advisor, saying we've got 2 to 3 years to determine the future of humanity. And the UN calling for transformative change, but still no action being taken. And so the environmental movement is stepping up even further with movements like Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil, taking the kind of civil resistance action, which is leading them to go to prison. And many people doing that willingly to try and create the change that's needed. So it's at this stage now that the climate-animal intersection sits. And before going on to talk about where we think the narrative needs to go, I'll pass over to Alex.
Thanks, Dan. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see my slides. And I'm hoping you can see that. Great. So this is the timeline that sort of Dan has just gone through. And obviously this is the Animal Futures Conference. So we sort of approached it with the idea of, let's look at where we've come from to see where we might go. And Dan will come back to that. The work I'm going to share is very much work in progress. We've just started to think about the ways in which we can approach the messaging and narrative of our movements, like the animal and climate movement together, maybe hyphenated. Can we look at it more deeply? Can we think about the ways in which it has accumulated and moved and built upon messages that have gone before to help us think about where effectively it might go? So I'm going to share some of the things I've been thinking about in terms of drawing upon developmental theories to think about when and where and how people are ready to take on board our messages and bring them into their life and enact them in the way that Veganuary does. You know, the Veganuary as the campaign to go vegan for January is a campaign of narrative enactment. It's actually something people do. In the social movement space, you know, groups are used to thinking about progress and change in terms of the development through stages. This, you know, the movement action map produced by Moya is from 1987. So, you know, and many people have been reading and using this for like 45 years. You know, like there are stages through which social progress moves. The question is, are we ready to see our messaging and narrative through that kind of developmental sequence or stage theory, and would it help to do that? There are at least 20 developmental stage theories of human cognitive and social development, and perhaps the most famous one is Piaget from childhood cognitive development. Maslow's, half Maslow's, because he obviously used a lot of stuff drawing from indigenous cultures there as well, and also people like Ken Wilber in the integral theory, who all see inner and outer changes going through processes of increasing complexity. And the question is, like, is that what we've been seeing? We're definitely seeing that in society. Have our campaigns and our messages kept step with that? Have we in fact led that? Have we been ahead of it? You know, how can we monitor that? The nugget, the basic core understanding of like the idea of developmental theory is that skills and knowledge and learning build upon each other. And as Tom Murray says in Metamodernism, Simplicity and Complexity, that seems an obvious fact, but its implications are surprisingly absent from most analyses of social, political, or cultural phenomena. Developmental principles help us avoid asking, expecting, or wishing that people would do or understand something when in fact they lack the developmental prerequisites. For example, we often judge people too harshly for not seeing systemic patterns in their cultural context, or for blindness to contradictory aspects of their personalities or beliefs. But these reflective skills are usually achieved through a privileged access to good education and mentoring, and to safe opportunities to practice and make mistakes. You know, the question is then, we often want people or social structures to change, but fail to take a close look at the assumptions made about their ability to change. And drawing on Keegan here, people are in over their heads. You know, we're asking people to change, but we very often, perhaps our messaging and narrative may not consider whether they're actually able to. You know, so is a population likely to change? So what we've been doing is thinking about how can we think about these developmental models of sort of personal, cognitive, and social cultural development, not only through the language we use, but also through like the campaign actions, like the work that we do in this environmental and animal space. And I've been working particularly on this with this idea of enactment analysis. Where do we think people are at in putting into practice, that is enacting the new narrative constructions we want them to go by? We want people to live by the idea that a plant-based food system is the only just and sustainable food system. Are people ready for that? And if not, are we still at the stage where we have to work with campaigns like Veganuary, or are we at the stage now where we can move beyond Veganuary, because Veganuary has done such, and other campaigns have done such good jobs of preparing people with the skills in that developmental model? So that's very brief, but I hope that sort of makes sense. Because People don't form their attitudes or change behaviors as a result of primarily information or expert communication. They're influenced by stories that feel right, presented by people they trust, and make action by the social norms around them. So people think, you know, can we put this into practice? You know, are other people doing this? So people take action when they understand the reasons for doing so and where those reasons resonate with their broader and deeper concerns. And also peer-to-peer communication is really important around values and identity, creating that social mandate for action, which is why, again, as Dan said, Extinction Rebellion was so important. Seeing people on the streets taking direct action has led to other forms of direct action, you know, coming you know, to the fore, such as Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain, and other last generation, Stop Old Growth Canada, those kind of movements. So what we're looking to do in any successful movement is close the salience deficit, where the public or power holders don't think the issue is important, and the power deficit, where the people wanting to change need to get power. So to do that, movements build campaigning infrastructure to tell stories, to speak to people's values and identities, to shift the debate, capture existing sources of power, and build alternatives. So I'm just going to skip over that. We've seen examples of the ways in which narratives have shifted and broken through barriers in society to understanding or knowledge, essentially leveled up in terms of this developmental approach. So if you think of George Floyd murder and institutional racism and the Black Lives Matter movement, that's really shifted the significance and reach of issues to do with racism. And here in the green line, the rebellion, the animal rebellion and the plant-based food system has shifted an understanding from an impossible idea, plant-based food system, into being something that's being discussed and looked at in much more sort of seriousness. So we understand that there's potential for movements to shift on the perceived significance of their movements and causes. But there are lots of you know, complexities around that, and it's really important to understand where those issues sit in society and culture in terms of people's understanding for whether they can shift them or not. So here you've got plant-based food system both being a complex and invisible issue for most people, but it impacts the public and impacts the powerful a lot. I mean, it's right up here. There's a lot of public resistance to it, and it's against the status quo. There's a lot of discomfort and would need a lot of moral change to bring about those changes. So you can see actually, like, the analysis of where people sit and fit with these ideas is really important for thinking about, can we change? Can we bring about change? So what's the messaging that we're going to need to use? At what developmental stage are people in society for listening and hearing these the messages that we want them to hear? Lots of, therefore, barriers to plant-based food systems to overcome. So these, you know, so we've done this analysis of looking at, you know, all of these issues and the possible responses to it. I'm not going to go into all of the detail of that, but it's important to think, okay, here's the barriers. This is where people are at. What are the possible responses? And that can lead us to thinking about the messaging that we want to use. And then lots of different, like the research methods that we've been using to look at that are the standard research methods you think about when you're trying to draw, you know, really get to think about what kind of messaging and narrative we need to shift people along, as well as some emergent research methods, including like this deep narrative cognitive understanding, as well as sort of really thinking about sort of like the spiritual, cultural, social, you know, mythical, almost like understanding of like people's values and identities and where they sit. So just very briefly then to finish, the ideas that I've been working with are about narrative enactment, getting us to think as campaigners, as organizational groups, how we get people to think about narrative and messaging as leading to actual change. So changes in actions, behaviors, interpretations. And so what we need is a change action loop that takes people from the narrative that leads not to the reproduction of existing actions, behaviors, and interpretations, but to scenarios where existing narratives don't work, feel right, or explain what to do, which therefore requires a new narrative And lots of this stuff is taken from Hans Hansen's book, Narrative Change. A reconstruction action loop is one where people pick up the story that they already believe about society, about themselves, about how to act. That controls their behavior and reproduces and reinforces that narrative. So it's okay to eat animals, for example. What we want is a change action loop where good campaigns create new scenarios or draw attention to the existing scenario where old narratives no longer make sense. And then we offer new narratives for how to act, behave, or interpret those new scenarios. Yeah, that's what's called narrative enactment. Some of it's unconscious and leads to reconstruction. That's when we think people are on autopilot. People consciously enact the narrative. They want to eat animals, for example. That's intentional reconstruction. What we're looking to them is to try to get them to think about narrative construction working in a different way, leading to new forms of behavior. And so just finally, what we're looking at is narrative enactment is based on this idea of what I raised there in terms of the Tom Murray quote about really considering the skills, knowledge, and developmental stage of the audiences that we're working with to assess what kind of messages they need to hear. So, for example, we need to reassemble new narratives out of things that people can already understand. It can't be completely alien to them. We need to think about how many times we need to repeat that story or get them to see the story through a particular lens. And also really take into account that a lot of this work is unconscious because people have, as we know, come to think of their behaviors as, Piazza's famous list, natural, normal, necessary, and nice, in terms of the way we exploit animals, for example. So I'm going to sort of leave it there. So that's just like a very quick snapshot of thinking about looking at the past 20 years of narratives in terms of climate and animal coming together, thinking about where the audiences have been at each stage for being ready to move on to new actions. Yeah.